timetables and logistics going forward. So we're not going to talk a lot about that today, but we will talk about that next week. So with that, Todd, do you want to come up and join me here? Thank you again for being here. Let's give him a big round of applause. Appreciate you.
Well, just in case you're shy, which I know you're not, I'm going to ask the first question of Todd. Todd, you painted a really honest picture of where we find ourselves. We all see it as we look out at the world ahead of us. What are you hopeful about for the American church and then for Crossroads as you are getting to know us?
Well, let me. First of all, thanks for being here. Just the very fact that many of you stayed is actually hopeful to me, because it means that we're interested, we see the reality that we're facing, and we want to go toward it. What makes me hopeful for the American church is a little less than what makes me hopeful for Crossroads. I'm more hopeful for you than I am for the church across the country, and I'll tell you the main reason why, which is hope to me is connected to humility. In the scriptures, humility is like the cornerstone virtue. Moses, who was the greatest leader of the Hebrew scriptures, was the most humble man on earth. Humility and learning is what actually allows people to change. And I've experienced that with your team. I mean, to have the competence and the expertise and the welcome and all the work of the Compass team, and to have every single time we begin to be in conversation with them, they are like, and what else can we learn? What else do you want us to learn? What else do you want us to know? It's been a really great thing. And you have an amazing pastor and staff team. Next week, you'll start getting more of the glimpses of what we've been learning. We did a big survey, and I can tell you, I'm going to blow one thing that's going to be so obvious, is that when we asked people what's working, the very top of the list was the leadership. Pastor Susan has stabilized us. We are thrilled with the leadership and the direction we're going. We trust them. We're ready to engage them. So that humility and eagerness to jump in is very hope-giving for me. My hope for the church, my sense of hopefulness for the church comes because every single day I wake up and I work with a leader like Pastor Susan or a team like the Compass team. Every meeting on my calendar is with someone saying, we know we want to be faithful to Jesus Christ, and we want our ministry to go forward, and we want to make a difference, so will you work with us? And so my life, our company, the work of I lead a company and I lead an institute that does research on this at the school. Our days are filled. Every meeting is with someone who wants to lead into the future, and that just gives me hope. It just feels like there's more and more people stepping into this space. So,
if you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand and we'll mock a microphone to you.
We have microphones.
The
back there in the back. Way to go.
Here, and we'll use it because we're live streaming, because some friends at home wanted to watch,
Yeah.
and recording because all of our Sunday school teachers
and
wanted
being the first person to ask a question, everybody will rise up and call you blessed. So,
Dr. Todd, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Is it
Todd is fine. Just call me
Todd.
Todd.
Is that fine? Okay,
Yeah.
My name's Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
Do you mind if I ask a question that's more of a historical question?
You can try.
Okay.
You got all the history I know right there, except for the Puritans. I got some English history. Yeah.
When I was in college years ago, I had a subscription to Christianity Today, and there was an article about how Europe was post-Christian.
Yeah.
Was that because of World War II, or was there multiple reasons, or do you know?
Yeah, so most of the folks, post-Christian gets confusing. That's why I use the word Christendom. And what Christendom means is, regardless of people's internal state with the Lord, the culture is moving away from being centered around Christianity, like the home court advantage thing. Europe's experience was less about World War II. It actually started in World War I. World War I was the time when there had been, up until then, there had been this great optimism about kind of the progress of the world and education, and the idea that the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, they would call it, would bring great, wonderful prosperity and good things for everybody. And then World War I happened and people saw atrocities.
Well, that's what I was wondering, because it was such a nightmare that people just lost faith in a good God. That was just my thought.
Yeah, that's one question. I would put it this way, though. Christendom, though, Leslie Newbegin was the person who made the biggest impact. He came back after being a missionary for his whole life in India. And when he got back to England, he said, the resistance to the gospel was stronger in England than it had been in India. And that was in the 1970s. And what most people are saying today is what's been happening in Europe is now beginning to happen in the United States.
Yeah.
And so, and the answer, I'm arguing, is not to go back and try to recover Christendom. It's actually to move forward into the mission of God in a way that will bring renewal. So, yeah, there you go. Thank you. Thank you, yeah. It's a great way to start. Please, I have a couple up here, so let's just go either way.
Thank you. I'm wondering about, it seems that we see the non-denominational church growing at paces faster than the denominations, and I just am curious about your thoughts on that.
That's true up until about 2000. Up until about 2000, a little bit, and in the early 2000s, the non-denominational churches were growing faster. Today, again, almost all churches are in decline. We Presbyterians, we're leading the way. We have 50 years of consecutive decline, right? So, so if we're going to do something, we're going to be number one at something. So what's interesting about that is that because early on, people said, oh, so the problem is it's mainliners or it's denominations or it's traditions. What we begin to recognize is that now it's actually, I think, more of a genuine crisis where, I've done a bunch of research at the moment. I actually think it's a crisis of discipleship. And I think that part of what happened during COVID was that we began to have people, it's the first major crisis, like it could be the first pandemic. Sociologists of religion are now studying this. It could be the first plague or pandemic since Jesus that the church didn't grow. Usually during a crisis, individual churches grow because people see the difference and they seek out Christians. We weren't that different. We actually followed most of the trends of the culture, right down to political division and right down to polarization. And so because of that, I think what's happening is you have people consolidating in some churches where there are charismatic leaders. And in general, though, the numbers are all in decline, including in the non-denomination. So some of that is just catching up now that we're beginning to see it. So, yeah. Microphone back there. Terrific. Thank you, sir.
Hi, thanks for the sermon this morning. It was very motivational.
Thank you.
This is kind of related to an earlier question. We see a lot in the church today, adult children of many of us leaving the church, and I'm sure you're aware of that as well. Yeah. Do you have some understanding of the mechanisms behind that?
Well, there's lots of work that's been done on this, and so I don't want to be flippant about this, like I have a quick 3 points, because I don't. What we're recognizing is the assumption, if you think about it this way, the assumption of the past, even some of our generation. So I'm 58. So just if you think about any of you track around my age, the assumption was you grow up in a Christian home, you train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are adults, well, they'll return after baptism. There's going to be a window in the middle where some folks would move away. But when you finally bring people, they start baptizing their own kids, they'll come back. And that's what's changed. People don't necessarily come back. And so part of what's happening is we don't have the same structures or expectations that of systems that people will necessarily come back. So what it means is we actually have to demonstrate a genuine faith that makes people want to continue to follow in that path. And so amongst younger adults, when they ask those questions, what they'll talk about very, very often is the church that I grew up in isn't willing to confront the challenges I face every day. They're not willing to take on those questions, those concerns. It feels like we just keep saying we want to go back to the old days. Like we want to return to the old days. If we just return, we'll go. These are folks who live in a world. I mean, my daughter and my son-in-law, they both work remotely, and they're going to travel through Europe in the next year and work remotely from Europe. They can. I would have done that when I was 26, but that wasn't even a consideration, right? So you start realizing now we live in this dramatically changed world, and our question we've got to ask is, how is it that we make disciples and live out the Great Commission in a world that's dramatically changed? And including the structures and the programs and the things we've invested in the past that people just may not be as invested in. And I can say more about that. We talk a lot about this work in our Compass work. We talk about the things of the past that made an impact that are like the good wine, but we end up arguing hard over protecting the wineskin factory. And what we've got to keep coming back to is how do you grow the fruit, create the soil, make the wine that's going to make the world glad? And that's the bigger challenge. And instead of arguing whether we have a twist off or a cork, like it's got to be a different way to think about it. So we'll go back here and then we'll come up here to you.
Would you address the role of men and their responsibilities and roles in the church, please?
They're just the role of men. Is that right? Yeah. Well, so this is the place where I think that we have to think differently about what the scriptures say as opposed to our culture. I think it's really, really important that women and men are called into ministry, that women and men share ministry. This is what you see in the scriptures. I see what you see in the work of Paul. I think you see this in the expectations of the Holy Spirit coming. The problem is that very often our programs are run so that men make decisions and women do the work. So if you just think about like churches run, most church programs that were run during a day when women didn't work, it counted on women volunteers and men to bring kind of wisdom and wealth, like in almost executive roles. Well, today you have women working as much. You have women executives. I work with women CEOs that run large companies. And so to be in women entrepreneurs, women pastors who are really powerful. So for us, we get a chance to model to the world a partnership that looks more like, to me, Romans 16 and the book of Acts, in a world where there needs to be a sense of shared partnership. That means men have to be willing to take on responsibilities and also have to be able to take on partnerships and collaboration. I think one of the powers of having such a really gifted pastoral team where you have both women and men working together is you get a chance to model that. You also get a chance to help men who have a tendency to think that religion is a sphere for men, to have wisdom and women do the work, to actually flip that up on its head and say it's actually shared across the way. So I tend to think in terms of partnership in every way. I will say one last part, which is so many of our church programs, because of the way they've been run, it's been difficult for a number of men who I had one man who was a president of a company say to me, I show up at the church, I've been a president of a company, you ask me to usher. I'm certainly willing to usher, but you don't ask me about everything else I bring to the table that I could bring. Well, this church does. I've seen your people. I think the same thing now can be said about women. I show up at the church, I bring lots to the table. I'd love to bring my whole gifts. I'd love to bring all my experience, my life, my background. So I think there's something about that shared partnership that is meant for the future. So, over here. I think so. I think they're going to hand you a microphone. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I feel like too often the voices that speak the loudest for Christianity kind of in the world outside the church paint a picture of Christianity that many of us who have grown up in the church don't necessarily recognize, certainly don't endorse, but that acts as a repellent, quite frankly. And I'm wondering why you think that might be, and if you see that changing at all.
Well, some of it is the way we engage the culture, right? So you know, there's an article this morning by David French. I'm just going to give you one reference. David French is a conservative columnist who has always been involved in, say, Republican politics and whatnot, yet he has become a vocal critic of the way in which conservative faith, including Christians, have begun to lose the character. It's about the character question. We've lost our ability to demonstrate the difference of our character. When the world sees us as just a reflection of the world, when evangelical becomes a pocket of voters for a political party, or progressive becomes a pocket of voters for a political party, when people see them as synonymous, then we don't get to demonstrate what it means to be salt and light. So I do think there's the part that we have to grapple with as Christians is, I don't think it's a marketing problem, I think it's a morals problem. I think we're not living out our faith with our neighbors in such a way that they're attracted to come be with us and experience us and ask questions about us. And so I think it's important for us to keep making the distinction between what does it mean for us to live out our faith in a world where people may not understand, and they may even characterize, they might caricature, or they might think of us as something that we're not. And instead of always saying, well, we're not that, we're not that, we're not that, how might we demonstrate, well, this is who we are? And I think with those stories aren't always told, and yet they need to be told neighbor to neighbor. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, hi. With COVID, I know more and more churches went to online services. And I'm just curious if you have any statistics behind, online services now keeping people away from the church. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have statistics because the problem with being an academic is that people will always check your statistics, so I stay away from those. But I will tell you this. I do think that one of the things we know is that the technology of online technology is now going to be with us forever. So the question isn't should we do it or not. The question is how we do it. It's not that much different. I mean, the exact same argument made about streaming services was once made around these things called cassettes. If you can give the sermon away to people and they can subscribe to your cassettes, they might not come to your worship service. Or I was raised in a church that had a television ministry. And the whole thing was, oh my gosh, if we have a TV ministry, why would anybody come? Well, I mean, now everybody has a TV ministry. It's called Facebook Live, right? So the question isn't technology. The question is how do we wisely use technology for our mission? And I think that's different in every church, in every context. I think it can be used better or worse. I mean, I do a lot of teaching online. On March 13, 2020, I went from traveling 100,000 miles a year to traveling 0 miles. I thought I wasn't going to do anything for the next 2 years. I didn't know what I was going to do. I did 170 webinars. So now our work actually is a combination. This is the first time I've met these guys face to face, and we had a meal, and we've been together, and it's great. And the next time I'm going to see them face to face is going to be in May, but we've been working for months, and we'll keep working. So technology is another tool we've got to learn to use wisely and well. And I don't think it's a matter of either or. I think it's going to be and then we can have more conversation about technology if you want. I'll stop there. If somebody else wants to probe more, we can go more. But I think that's where I start for now. So there you go. Thank you.
Hi. You gave some statistics about the church in the 60s going down. So I know it's pretty well known that organizations, oftentimes success leads to arrogance, leads to complacency, leads to decline. Do you think that has been a contributor?
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's so Jim Collins wrote a book, How the Mighty Fall, and it's really about how what ends up happening is as people are successful, they get hubris. That's why I think humility is important, right? They get hubris. They end up doing more and more and more and more until they kind of collapse under their same weight. And I think what tends to happen in larger churches, and you guys are certainly in that category of larger churches. I mean, today, a medium-sized church is 100 people in worship. A large church is 250. So a very large church is anything over 800. It's shifted, right? So what happens is that in a lot of large churches, what's happened is we believed the growth meant addition. Add staff, add budget, add programs, add buildings. Add more. Faith is adding more. Today, I think growth means discernment. What is it God's called us to do? What do we need to do wisely and well? And what do we need to do in partnership with the rest of our brothers and sisters who are also doing things? What is it that God wants us to do? I always say if a bigger church was more blessed than a smaller church, then a bigger family would be considered more blessed than a smaller family. And I got a friend who's got 5 kids, and I only got 2, and I think my family's pretty good, right? So I don't think it's about size or numbers anymore as much as it's about fruitfulness, which needs discernment, which means we need to not fall into the traps of the past, which was whatever we need to grow. Instead, I think we need to think about fruitfulness and quality of transformation of lives. So, thank you. I talk fast so we can get a lot of questions in. So, yeah. Please, over here. Hi. Ange.
Morning.
Good morning.
In your sermon, you spoke about the wisdom that can be gained by listening to marginalized voices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are some practical, meaningful ways that we can do that as we enter this time of listening and discernment?
Yeah, thank you. One of the ways to think about this is there's two very so let me put it this way. I spend my life. This is my life as a scholar and a consultant in 2 spheres. One sphere is all of the stuff that you'd get out of organizational leadership. So any of you who are reading Harvard Business Review, I'm reading the same stuff you're reading, like those organizational leadership best practices. The other is in the deep spiritual formation of the church. So any of you who are reading like Ignatius or Augustine or the Prayer of Examines, I spend my time there too. We bring those together. What's interesting is in both spheres, the notion that there are voices we are not listening to, right? So where it shows up in the Gospels or in stuff like when the woman comes to Jesus and Jesus says, hey, I can't talk to you because you're not Jewish. And she said, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs off the table. When the woman who comes from another culture, and Jesus blesses her, he's saying to the leaders, hey, we need to pay more attention to somebody like her. The Samaritan woman, we need to pay more attention. The Ethiopian eunuch. You start looking through the scriptures and you start realizing there's all these folks who, when the Spirit wakens people up, they go, oh my gosh, God's already been at work in these people, and so we need to do a better job of listening to them. So what the organizational literature will tell you is companies that work on getting more diverse boards and teams do better. Less ethics, less ethical violations, better bottom line, like all those kinds of things. The key, and so this would be the thing I'd say, is the key is not settling for one. So one voice. So we have one kid, we have one youth, we have one woman, we have one person of color, we have one, it's not just about tokenism, it actually doesn't change. When you get more than one voice in the room, what happens is the multiple perspectives make everybody else listen better. So when I sit in a room and I have two of my young adults say to me, Dad, that joke doesn't work. When one of them does, I go, you've always been sensitive. When two of them say, Dad, that thing's going to land badly. That thing didn't age. You don't say it that way. And then I go, well, why? So the key is creating environments where there's as much diversity of perspective to bring insight so that the people making decisions then have much more. Again, humility is what opens to it. And one of the reasons I tell the story about Sacagawea is that it was this remarkable story of how these men who had been cultivated in the worldview of the day. I mean, Lewis and Clark were both slaveholders. William Clark was known as a brutal slaveholder. He brings along York, and because York is his most trusted slave, and while they're on the Corps of Discovery, York is treated like an equal. So much so that by the time they get home, York says, I'm wondering if you would do me a favor and just sell me to another master so that I can be with my wife, who I haven't been. Everybody else gets to go back to their wives. You sold my wife. Can I go to another master so I can go back to my wife? Clark writes to Lewis and says, I had to beat York because he got so arrogant because we gave him that. It's like this tragic story, right? Meriwether Lewis he's brought up, literally discipled, mentored by Thomas Jefferson in the White House. Sacagawea, they don't write a single word that she says. They just have her around. And then all of a sudden they realize, oh, they need her. And when they need her, they absolutely treat her well, they invest, they talk about how important she is. I mean, Clark ends up actually adopting her son and helping her son be raised. I mean, it's this amazing story. Meriwether Lewis goes home, and he now suffers from all of the depression that he'd had before. It was like at bay when he was on the journey. He ends up committing suicide. So these two amazing people end up having this tragic ending. And what I always say is, when Jefferson was asked how Meriwether Lewis, who suffered from depression and alcoholism, how he possibly did so well on the journey, the answer he said was the travails of the expedition probably kept those demons at bay. And he had Clark, and they were open to a different form of leadership. They were at their best when they were on mission. And so it's a long answer to say to you, most of us are at our best when we're out there beyond our skis. When we're out on mission, we're taking risks, we're listening to people, we're engaging the people in the community, we're getting younger voices involved, we're breaking through some of our institutional biases to be able to listen. When we go back to normal, we go back to our old ways. And we really are at our best the more we're on mission. And the church has been the same way, and organizations tend to be the same way. That when we're in that humble, learning, growing, experimenting phase, we tend to be at our best. And I think one of the ways that we do that is by getting more voices to speak into what we just wouldn't otherwise see. So.
What if those voices aren't in the room?
So one of the things to do is think about projects just think about single projects you can do where you can engage voices. Right, just think of one. I'll give you, this is a longer story, but I love this story, so I'll tell it. I'm a bit of a storyteller. So when I had a 30-year-old on my staff. My worship director was 30 years old. She turned 30, and she's going to have a big party. So she said, hey, we're having a birthday party. We'd love you and Beth, my wife, to come. You're important to me. We were like 50 at the time. I said to Beth, we'll go to the party. We're not going to know anybody. And it's going to be awkward, but I love Brianne. We got to go to her birthday party. So we prepared. We're going to go to the party. We're going to hug her. We're going to walk around. And they said they're going to do karaoke, and I'm like, I'm not doing that. And so literally, like, I'm preparing to leave. I walk in the room. We get there a few minutes late. We're going to do we're here late. We hug, we leave. Like, we're actually planning to go to dinner. We walk in the room, and we know everybody. I'm like, oh my gosh, I know everybody here. They were all 30-year-olds who had once gone to our church. And I thought, oh, this is going to be awkward. We should leave. And it wasn't awkward at all. They're totally hugging us. Pastor Todd, Beth, it's so glad to see you. I was hoping you'd come, but Rianne said you were coming. So I'm in a total funk the whole night because I'm like, okay, first of all, there's all these young adults who don't go to my church anymore, and it's not because they're mad at me. I don't even know what to do about that. So I went to Brianne the next day, and I said, Brianne, I told her the same story, and she went, I know, I was a little awkward. I thought you were going to see all these. They're my friends. I'm the worship leader, and they don't come to church even because I'm the worship leader. And I went, I have no idea why this is. You'd think, we got this great worship leader. She's their friends, that she would attract. Her own friends don't even come. So what I said was, would you get a group of them together so that I could just ask them questions? I promise I will not shame them. I will not recruit them. I just want to know. And so for 6 weeks, I bought pizza and beer and gathered in an apartment. And I just said, I just want you to tell me about your spiritual journey and what it is we can do as a church to be able to reach people like you. They had no answers. They told us really different stories. And then about half the group started coming back to our church. And now 2 of them are elders in that church. There was no silver bullet. But just the engagement, finding a way to engage was a way that began. I think over time we did make changes, but there was no like, oh, if you had better coffee, if you had a smoke machine, if you got rid of the word Presbyterian, called yourself the Flood, there was none of that. So I think one of them is finding projects, things we care about, where we can say, let's get other people and engage other people who will become friends that we can then ask these questions to. And that can be done in lots and lots of ways. Yeah. Okay, so that was a much longer story, but I love that story, so yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for coming and sharing your stories and sermon. You talk about looking back and how we've done stuff, and we've got our classic measurables of membership and budget.
Yeah,
and you mentioned earlier, buildings and all this kind of stuff. Looking out into the mountains and in the future, what are the measurables that we should be using to see if we're reaching any goals that we set?
Yeah, I love this question because almost every client we work with, what we realize is one of the things that has to change is our metrics. Our metrics are no longer measuring for us the fruitfulness that we want. It's like having the wrong. It's like saying, the metric of a basketball team is how tall they are. If you have 5 tall people, we're going to win. No, the metrics is winning. You might want a tall person and Steph Curry wouldn't have made the grade. He's not tall enough. So you have to think about the metrics. Our point is we now want to see metrics follow mission. So in almost every place, we've got to help them rethink their metrics. Now, there are some metrics that are just important, sustainability metrics. Like, math is still math. You still have to have, black ink instead of red ink when it comes to money, right? But it's no longer, hey, more money necessarily means better. Or it's no longer bigger means better. Look at all the tech companies right now that are basically, downsizing dramatically. So one of the parts is trying to figure out which metrics actually drive our mission. So what we're spending a lot of time with, and this is what your group's doing great, is we're already beginning to understand that getting a real clear sense of our identity, who we are now, and what is God calling us to be as a church because of the way the world has changed, is going to create different metrics. And it's going to help us think through that in a good way. And that shift is going to be significant. And so one of the examples I told with the group last night, is I'm working with a church right now in Texas that is got 2,000 members. And they said their mission was, we want to have our mission more and more reflect our neighborhood. We want to be missional. We want our church to reflect our neighborhood so that our neighbors understand that we are here for them, that it'll be easier barriers, less barriers to entry, more friendships. And they recognized that as the neighborhood was becoming more multi-ethnic, so it's a more multi-ethnic neighborhood, their church needed to become more multi-ethnic. So they stepped into that and began to work on, what does it mean for us to be a multi-ethnic movement of missional disciples? That's their mission statement. 2,000 members. It's really remarkable. They got about the most diverse staff I've ever seen. And not because diversity is important, but because mission is important, and this is what our neighborhood is like. So we need to reflect our neighborhood. So they're having all this success, 2,000 people, the most diverse staff I've ever seen, moving, filling out their mission. They only have one problem. He preaches to 500 empty seats every week. Because they built their church when they had 5,000 members, and they told the members, if you help us rebuild our church, just 15 years ago, we'll grow to 10,000 members. So the metric used to be, are we growing toward 10,000 members? Today, he gets up there and they've said, our mission, we've discerned, is to be this, we really want to be a church that ministers to this growingly, rapidly changing multi-ethnic neighborhood. So that means we're going to live into that, and they're not going to be 5,000 members. He literally has people say to him, we could grow to 10,000 members if you'd get rid of all that woke stuff. Now they have a decision to make. What's our mission? That becomes the most important thing. What's our mission? Who are we and what's our mission? That's discernment. The metric has to follow. So, he has said, it's really hard for me to think there are still people out there who will say, I'm not a successful pastor and we're not doing well because we got empty seats. But we got empty seats because we got a building that was built under a different mission. And so now that is actually shaping the metrics. They have to rethink the metrics that they have for today. And that still means he still has to have a good budget. He still has to hit the metrics they do. But the shaping of the metrics will be different. And I think this is one of the parts that the church is going to have to grapple with in a huge way, especially, I'll just add one more thing, especially around spiritual formation. Discipleship and the forming of people to be disciples for the world today has not been the fruit of the models of the last generation. And if you don't believe me, take Willow Creek's word for it. I worked with the guy who did the Reveal study at Willow Creek, and I've been known him really well, and we've talked a lot about the fact that they had to grapple, even at a place like Willow Creek, that their megachurch model was not reproducing people who talked about having a deeply formed spiritual life. And that we're still working on. And so your metrics will often take you to a different goal than you intend. You've got to rearrange them. And that's some of the work we'll do. We're going to be with you for the next year and a half or so, and I guarantee you metrics are going to be on the back end of that. Those metrics that need to be done to fulfill the mission that they discern. So.
Any other questions for Tod?
There's somebody back here. Okay. And then Susan, if you think there's a question somebody wants to ask but isn't asking, you get to ask it. You get to ask the hard question if you think there might be. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tod, so much. When it comes to learning people's story,
if
I want to learn someone's story, it takes time.
Yeah.
And it takes effort. And you have to get it on the calendar if it's in proximity or a phone call or whatever it might be, or FaceTime.
Yep.
What are your thoughts about how to make that happen well? So there's good listening on both parts.
Yeah. So it's interesting. One of the exercises that you're all going to be doing in our work is a storytelling exercise. And so let me just say this, that when the group comes to you and says, hey, we're going to be doing this storytelling exercise, I really encourage you to get everybody you can to come. And it's going to be a relaxed evening where you just tell stories. And here's the reason why. When you tell stories, you actually start hearing people's hearts. You start hearing we did this exercise with a church where they literally had tables all over a room like this. And the guy I was with was a therapist. He was one of my consultants. He's also a therapist in his day job. And he looked at it, he said, Todd, you can tell who's telling the story because the person telling the story is doing this. Oh, let me tell you about Ruth. Oh my gosh, you should have met her. She was amazing. She was our Sunday school teacher when I was a kid. And everybody else starts going, oh. Like the stories are right out of your heart. And what happens is when you tell those stories, you really get clear on we're willing to make these changes if we don't lose our hearts. What we want to hold is this thing that's precious to us. The challenge isn't, oh, we need to change because we'll lose market share. The challenge is we need to change because we have something so valuable that has been so life-giving that we would like it to be life-giving to new people who will never touch it otherwise. I was with a group of Episcopal clergy, and I was in New York City. If you ever go to New York City, every neighborhood in New York has an Episcopal church, and they're beautiful. Because there was a time in the early 20th century when there was like the battle of the billionaires. Oh, Chelsea has a great cathedral church. We'll have a great one. And they just made better and better and better ones. And a lot of them are really empty. But I know a lot of the clergy, and they're these deeply committed people. And what I said to them was, go back and tell stories about what matters here, what really has been life-changing. It'll motivate you to be able to help people make the changes needed. But remember, the goal isn't this church has to survive no matter what. Paul's churches are all dead. The goal is that Paul's churches are dead, but we're here. The goal is to make sure that there's a witness for faith that will pass that faith on to the generations. And so what we want to do is do everything we can to be the kind of community that for as long as the Lord would have us is vibrantly passing on the faith to people who otherwise wouldn't come. The weird part is it starts by taking the time to pay attention to the deepest stories in our church and listening to the story of other people to know where we can make those connections. So I just think that deep listening is at the heart of adaptive change work. But you'll hear us talk a lot about listening all the way through. But not just to listen for listening's sake, but because listening creates attunement, and attunement accelerates the change. Once we know what's most important, then we can recognize this is the wine. This is so important. And so we are willing to let the wineskins go or rethink the way of delivering it so that we can get it. And that becomes important. Yeah. Please, got a couple more. Good. And there's one in the back too. So, okay, we got a couple. So let's just, where do you want to start?
Go.
Start in the back and then we'll come back up here to you. You hold that microphone and you'll be next.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I have a question about how do we achieve a balance between the sinking morality in society and keeping the church pure?
Yeah. The what morality in society?
Sinking morality.
Descending morality and keeping the church pure. So this is one of the ways I think about this. The church talks about holiness and not purity. And that's often confusing to most of us. Holiness is the degree to which we reflect our God. So the way we focus on is to keep saying, we want to raise up people who look more and more like Jesus, who have the heart of Jesus, who have the heart of God, and who embody that in everyday life. The world may take on all kinds of other things, but as for me and my house, this is going to be our focus. Dallas Willard has this great phrase. I love this. He says, spiritual formation is you becoming who Jesus would be if Jesus were you. Think about this. It's not you becoming Jesus. It's pretty hard for me to figure out how to become a first century Palestinian carpenter. It's me becoming who Jesus would be if Jesus was me. So the morality that I want us to have is if Jesus walked through here and was living in this section of Wisconsin, and Jesus does that as the people who come out of this church, If Jesus did it, they would go, that's what Jesus looks like. And that's what we have to do. And if we only reflect the values of the world wherever they go, we'll never be able to be that. And if all we ever talk about is condemning the world, well, then we don't look a lot like Jesus, who actually went in with great compassion to people who were struggling and called them to a deeper life. So I don't spend a lot of my time on purity, but I spend a lot of my time thinking about holiness and formation as the focus. Somebody was up here, and then let me come back there after that. So here, you've been waiting.
So you had mentioned that there's a group of people that, if you're standing at the Rockies, there's a group that's ready to just forge through. There's some that are going to canoe back down the river. There's ready. How do you make sure that all the groups are represented and also allowing each group to be diverse and different?
Yeah.
So you're not holding anybody back.
Yeah, so and I appreciate this because in my book, I talk about the fact that even amongst this clergy, we have this kind of unconscious thing. Some of us are people who say, my job is to take care of the saints. And I met a guy once who basically, he and I were at Fuller and we were talking. He had been a CEO of a company, and then he became a Christian, and then he became a pastor. And I had been raised at Hollywood Press. And so when I met him, I thought, oh, I want to talk to a guy who used to be a CEO about the leadership stuff I'm learning. And he looked at me and said, hey, here's what I do. My ministry now, it has nothing to do with that stuff. I take care of grandma. I minister in a convalescent home. My job is to hold her hand until she goes to the hand of Jesus. I hug them and kiss them, and I sing to them, and they sing to me, and it's beautiful, and I love this work. I take care of grandma. He goes, what do you do? And I looked at him and thinking to myself, I'm kind of a take the hill guy. Like, I'm kind of the guy going, come on. And so we looked at each other, and we realized this is where many of us get stuck. You know, is our job to take care of grandma, to take care of the people, the saints of the church? Or is our job to take the hill, to do the mission? And here's what I want you to hear. If you are trying to decide as a church what you're going to be, you've got to be a people who take the hill. That's the mission of God. But you got to take grandma with you because we're the church. So we have to create an environment where everybody can be involved in the mission of God and where everybody is invited in. And as a guy who's now closer in age to grandma, I don't want to be left behind either. Like, I want us to recognize that our ministry is about bringing people together, but it's not just to gather around the campfire. It's actually to keep moving the mission forward. But we go forward really differently. We're not a core discovery that gets to handpick people. We're taking everybody with us, and we're inviting everybody in. Now, you can't make people go. They're going to leave. I mean, I teased Susan. I said, somebody got up and left in the middle of the service. If it's about me, blame me, right? Right? But the people are going to leave. People may not want to go, but our job is to create the community that everybody gets to go. We care for people. I would say caring is not necessarily making people comfortable. It's caring for them as we move forward into what's uncomfortable. And so we have to bring people together in that. That's my answer to that. You're back here and then back here. Good.
Yeah, so thank you. This has been great. So I'm going to touch on a few things that you've mentioned. So ensuring basically that the Holy Spirit comes with us and is guiding us in this process is like huge, right? And I know that having been formerly on session, there's a lot of passion and love around that in this church, a lot of great ideas and deeply felt and held beliefs, right? My question is, how do we bring that all along with us, as well as grandma, given our current paradigms and how we actually operate as a body, right?
Yeah.
How do we, what's your advice to us from your heart about how do we, I think sometimes what we've done is we've had these brilliant, beautiful, moving visions, mission, and then it gets translated on paper and it becomes dull, flat, and no longer inspirational. So how do you move from inspiration in the vision of a prophet to paper in a practical way?
To me, the most important thing to keep asking is, as we pray, I told this to leaders yesterday, the most important trait that needs to happen in a leadership through change is discernment. And the most important spiritual practice for a congregation is discernment. It's discerning, and discernment is this the Holy Spirit or not? Is this the Spirit of God? If the Spirit of God says yes, and there's lots of practices, and I won't go through that today, but there's lots of work you can do on how you discern that. Once that's true, then we have to embody it. Like, you have to live into it. That's the whole point of Pentecost, is it doesn't just fall on people and they stay in the upper room. It's that they embody that in all their decisions. So I think when something gets on paper, the way you described it, what you're asking is, how might we embody what we believe the Spirit is calling us to do? And that's really built, again, around our sense of identity and our sense of mission. And whatever we're called to do, that's what we do. And we're going to have to probably let go of other stuff along the way that gets in the way of that. So it's that keep making decisions that are focused on the things that who we are and what we're called to be and how we adapt. So we have someone here, and then Susan, whenever we need to be done, you just tell me. Yeah.
Yeah, following on that a little bit, you talked earlier about Lewis and Clark kind of going back after this journey, this inspiring journey where everyone's energized and it's different, and then going back to old ways. So
Yeah.
are there, can you just talk a little bit about the ways you'll be equipping us
Yeah.
on the journey so that
Yeah.
once we're done with
Yeah.
this year and a half with you and you go
Yeah.
off and
Yeah.
we're here, just what are some of the ways that you'll be equipping us to
Yeah.
continue?
Well, one of the first things we do is we've done a deep dive on who we are, right? We've begun to, and the next thing that's going to happen is there's going to be some focus groups where we're going to ask some different folks. Not all of you could have participated in a survey, and all of you are going to be invited to participate in storytelling. Some people will be invited into focus groups so that we get a deep understanding of who we are and really what we're facing, the reality, right? So partly we want to teach you to, wherever you get stuck, pause and learn to see a problem before you solve a problem. It's like the first thing we teach people. People just want to solve it. And most of you are here in this room, I had somebody say to me yesterday, like I'm a mom, I solve problems. like, right? Like, what are we going to do? And I'm always frustrated. I'm like, we're going to see problems before we solve them so that we're not solving them with old practices. So we can learn new things. That's the first thing we're going to teach you how to do. The second thing we're going to teach you to do is how to experiment. And experiments aren't, oh, did this work? Experiments are, what can we learn? What do we need to learn about our community? About, like one of the questions I would say is, what do we need to learn about listening to people about if we would like to be younger, we'd like to have more diversity, we'd like to reflect our community. What do we need to learn? Instead of trying, oh, this will work, let's get pizza. Let's go instead ask people. Let's learn what would it take. And so getting curious and humble. So seeing before solving, experimenting. We're going to teach you how to do that and learn as you go. And then we're going to teach you basically how to align all of that so that you keep moving, so that all of your resources keep going in a direction. I was talking with a group last night, and they said, what you're really talking about is we're going to learn a whole different way of continually responding to a changing world. It's not just one plan. And that's what we say. We don't give you a strategic plan. We teach you how to adapt and be strategic about all your planning, because the world's going to keep transforming. Okay. So.
Thank you. Tod, thank you so much for your time with us today. And just a reminder, our session has set a theme for the last year to be an intentionally praying congregation. And if you don't click on the prayer web every week, I encourage you to do so. And on there, about 4 bullets down, is the compass process. So I encourage you all to pray, because we've been paying attention to how the Spirit's been working. It's been powerful. And I encourage you all to pray for Crossroads, for the elders, for yourselves, how we can be open to the Spirit. And we're teaching a class on prayer to help us pay attention to the Spirit. And if you haven't come on Wednesday nights, just a plug to come and check that out as well. Go in peace.
Mm-hmm.